Yo, champion making. Demon Souls has been the hardest game I've ever had to beat. I last attempted it 5 years ago, losing that save to a hard drive corrupted by Infamous 2, a game that I'm still too afraid to put back in my system. And prior to that, my original PS3 got yelled at death, which took my original save of Demon Souls with it. And according to trophy information, that save was 13 years ago. It's taken me 13 years to defeat Demon Souls and lull the old one back to slumber. And I still remember the initial release of Demon Souls. It seemingly had a fairly low print run and a somewhat muted acknowledgement by magazines, which by the way were still a prominent part of the gaming news landscape at the time. But it all gave the game a certain mystique, so to find the game was harder than most, to find information about it was harder than most, and to beat the game was damn near impossible. I still remember the day I found my copy. We went back to my friend's flat, we booted it up, and a room full of gamers could not get past the bridge at the start of 1-1. Now, in a post-Dark Souls world where Souls-like has become an entire genre unto itself, it may seem hard to imagine how the control scheme and general design philosophy of a Souls-like could not feel, entirely intuitive. But, I remember it. It really was unlike anything that had come before it, and it completely ignored the gaming literacy of the previous decades as it carved out its new language on a generation with every death. Now, I love Dark Souls. It's a top 10 game for me. It changed the way I viewed games, and for a long time, I loved watching blind playthroughs of the game, just waiting for that eureka moment where the mindset that the game demands just clicks with the player. And I never would have been able to beat Demon Souls if I hadn't first had that eureka moment with Dark Souls. And it actually amazes me how far I'd managed to brute force my way through Demon Souls 13 years ago. When it tried to communicate its new language, I just talked over it. I only heard it in Dark Souls, and I think that's because Dark Souls made it easier to listen to. Because Dark Souls is actually a much simpler game than Demon Souls. I'll be honest with you, I'm still not 100% sure how world tendency works. I think it's a brilliant idea. The more death and general bad behavior present in a world makes it a more unpleasant place, and this then encourages like a feedback loop. But outside of advanced play where you deliberately manipulate world tendency to your own end, it basically punishes you for playing poorly by making the game harder. And I can't help but applaud the conviction to the design here. This took guts. They were already basically upending the gaming landscape without taking this extra step. But if I'm honest, I think they probably should have released a game without world tendency first, and then added it into a sequel, but we've also got to understand that this was before they'd made their mark, and a sequel wasn't guaranteed. Now, the Archdemons of Demon Souls were also something that now, having beaten them, I feel are another gameplay peak, and they've been either misunderstood or willfully misrepresented. Now, I'll concede that a dragon god hanging around two ballistae that are conveniently pointing directly at it, it's not the usual thoughtful design we're accustomed to from Miyazaki, but, weirdly, it's often Maiden Astrea's suicide that gets the most debate about the quality of its design. And to be clear, this discussion, it was often, I won't always, but it was often so reductionist that I was expecting her encounter to be something like Oscar's, where the outcome is predetermined, and it just reflects on the player if they choose to attack or not. And I still thought that would be really cool to see. But, as basically everyone until me the other day knew, but seemingly was deliberately misleading me, it's actually way more than that. All those archdemons, except for old King of Land, turn a boss fight into a boss level, complete with hazards and mooks and narrative significance. So to return to Astrea, for example, to suggest that her suicide is anticlimactic as you don't get to brutalize her, ignores the plague-inflicting swamp, her followers, and the heavily armoured Garl Vinland that you have to go through to reach her. For her to acknowledge that she is no match for you after witnessing that, and no doubt distressed from the death of her longtime friend and the followers whose well-being she has dedicated herself to, makes total sense. And hey, if you are quick enough, I'd imagine you actually could kill her the old-fashioned way if you were quick or cheesy. She's got a health bar after all. And while we are considering the lore of Demon Souls, I think it's fair to say that the Kingdom of Boletaria feels somewhat small time compared to Lordran or Drang Lake, and it's also not as out there as Yharnam. It feels like there are less NPCs, their motivations are straightforward, and the way the world interacts with them is simpler. So the higher classes have been usurped by demons, witches are hunted down, the poor were already miserable, so the change to a souls-based economy made little impact on them. And it's not bad by any means. It's got more going on than a lot of other media, but it's relative child's play to where the series would progress to. But there are two things that are great about going back to Demon's Souls. The first is seeing the bones of all the games that would have followed. So the Cthulhu elements of Latria, the dragons guarding the bridge, that one NPC who doesn't play nice with the others. And while it's not canonically related, the layout of some sections of the upper levels of the Boletaria castle, to me, felt a lot like the Castle of Lothric, but again, you could do side-by-side map comparisons. I'm just saying that's how I felt. Now the second thing that's truly great about Demon's Souls is how the lore interweaves with the game mechanics, and the example that comes to mind principally here is the fog doors. Now even in later games there's not really an explanation for these, it's just accepted that they're there either for loading or later on entries in the series where I assume, the program's improved, certainly the hardware's improved. I'm guessing they're simply as a callback. But in this game there actually is lore about the existence of fog, and even of one character traversing, I think it might be Bior, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. Now, there's not a lot of this interweaving of lore with mechanics, but it is more than you see in just about every other game. And just as a quick side note, an absolute masterpiece of this is the first and only the first God Eater game. Now, in his review of the PS5 remakes, the eminent sage Vati said something to the effect that while he was happy that the game had been so faithfully reproduced, he was disappointed that Bluepoint had not taken the unique characteristics of Demon's Souls and embellished them further, since, as developers, they had shown appropriate understanding and deference to the original game to be trusted with that task. And making my way through New Game Plus now, I have to concur with this. Everything about Demon's Souls, its essence, its innovations, says that this is a game that the zeitgeist should hold with the same regard as its successor. But we don't. Because this gem is too imperfect. Yes, Dark Souls also has its problems, and I'll be sure to make the same criticism if it gets a next-gen remake from the ground up and has the same pacing issue and general lackluster post-Sen's Fortress that Miyazaki has gone on record saying was due to budgetary constraints that should not be present the next time around. It would still be enjoyable, but the potential present in both these games, I would say, has not been fully realised. They're wonderful as they are, but the potential of Demon's Souls, especially with its quirky decisions, risky design, and an audience that finally understands the language it first started speaking so many years ago, well, I'd like to set my peepers beyond that fog door. But that's just my take on a game, a series that holds a weird level of significance to me, actually beating that little known game, that little cultural secret, where the only thing that was ever talked about all those years ago was that it was hard, real hard, that preceded the parlance of tough but fair and getting good, after beating every other Soulsborne, and after 2 system failures, sat on my shelf the one game I'd never beat. And now I have. And it's so good that I'm still trapped in the Nexus.